Hello, believers, non believers, and everyone in between. You're listening to Stories with Sapphire. I am Sapphire Sandalo. Now get cozy and open your mind because it's story time. A few weeks ago, I received an unting, or magical Filipino amulet, from my sis, Lynn Pacificar. You may remember her from previous episodes. She creates incredibly powerful amulets and adornments available at herbalaria.com. When I received it, she said that she was going to send me the orasyon, or prayer, to activate the unting. She was to handwrite it, so it would take a while. A few days later, I was having a hard time falling asleep. When I eventually did, I had this wildly vivid dream of a demon coming to me. Its face was sort of like a Japanese Hanya mask with red and blue paint. My entire body was completely tense, like when your body shivers when it's so cold. I reached toward my neck with my hand and clutched my unting. My muscles relaxed. I'm safe, I thought to myself. The demon continued to stare and scowl at me. I had to do something. I opened my mouth and, to my surprise, began to recite the Lord's Prayer. I felt so conflicted about it. I'm no longer a practicing Catholic. I genuinely cannot remember the last time I said this prayer. Why is this what I chose? And as I'm praying, the demon became smaller and smaller, weaker and weaker.
Amen.
I don't really remember much else about how the dream ended, but it was so lucid and felt significant. I texted Lynn the following day about what happened. She replied, "The orasyon you said is the correct beginning to the unting activation." The orasyon is a long text of many different prayers, and the first prayer is the Lord's Prayer in Tagalog. So I was subconsciously activating my unting in my dream. To me, this was a testament to how powerful Lynn's amulets are. Perhaps this was also spirit preparing me for the theme of this week's episode: demons. A word that invokes many different reactions. On this show, I try my best to not contribute to the sensationalization of demonic entities. The spirit world is not as black and white as demons equals bad. It's complex and layered. Not everything is necessarily evil. But those aren't the demons we'll be discussing this week. This is the extra long Halloween special. And this week, we're gonna get creepy. So turn off the lights, grab your protective amulets, and listen to these true stories from real people who have been the unfortunate witness to horrifying inhuman entities. First, I narrate the time someone messed around with a Ouija board and welcomed in a taunting entity. Next, Aaron Sagers tells us about the demon his brother summoned in his childhood home that led to a string of bizarre incidents. Then, I read an email from someone concerned about the dark entity following their brother. And finally, Pythian Priestess tells us the experience that caused her to quit her job as a ghost tour guide. Chapter 1, You're Mine Now, submitted by Cheyenne. Hello, Sapphire. I'm not even entirely sure I can work up the nerve to actually send this email. My name is Cheyenne. I'm 32 years old, and I've had experiences with the paranormal my entire life. I'm new to listening to podcasts, but my husband and I love your show, and if I share my stories, I would be honored to share them with you. I've had a wide range of experiences, from recalling parts of my past life as a World War II pilot, including my past death, in detail, to being possessed after foolishly playing with a Ouija board as a teenager, even being tormented by a poltergeist in my early 20s. My family and I even took a very unsettling trip to an abandoned asylum in West Virginia, where we saw a doppelganger and something took hold of my sister for a moment. Even now, the experiences are almost part of my daily life, more so since my dad passed away suddenly in May. Trying to sit here and think through everything I've experienced, felt, seen, heard, even smelled, the Ouija board story might be the best one to lead off with. I was 15 years old in the mid-2000s, and my cousins were visiting from out of state. We were all close in age, and even though they lived in Texas and we lived in Ohio, it was like we grew up under the same roof. The house we lived in was one of the oldest in town. It used to be part of a Catholic parish, and the basement was once used as a morgue. There was a newer part of the house, which is where my brother's room was. So my cousin Caleb, also about 15 at the time, had brought a friend along to our house. That night, my oldest cousin, my younger sister, my baby brother, and I decided to get my Ouija board out and see if we could talk to anything. We asked Caleb and his friend if they wanted to join. They instantly said, "No, that's something you shouldn't mess with." We laughed at them. I said, "It glows in the dark and it's made by Hasbro. It's a toy." We were foolish. We took the board to my sister's room, turned off the lights, and closed the door. My older cousin asked if there was anything there. It started to move to yes. And everything went cold and somehow even darker. I suddenly couldn't breathe. I felt like I was alone, stuck in my mind, with only an unfamiliar voice echoing, "You're mine now." My body twisted and my back arched. As soon as my hands left the planchette, the board flipped. My sister ran and opened her door, and the instant she did, I was fine. Like it never happened. A few minutes later, Caleb and his friend came to the doorway and asked how it went. I chuckled, about to laugh off what had just happened, but I glanced at the board again, and before I could speak, I twisted once more. Suddenly, back in the darkness and cold, the voice was louder now, and it was laughing. "I said you're mine now," it growled at me. At this point, I couldn't move. I wasn't aware of anything around me, just darkness, cold, and that voice. Caleb, his friend, and my sister all picked me up and carried me to the bathroom across from my brother's room, part of the newer addition. I started gasping for air and began moving again. We put the board away, sat in my brother's room, and talked about what happened. Ever the glutton for punishment, honestly, I chalk it up to curiosity and stubbornness. I wanted to investigate more. So I convinced my cousins to follow me to my room in the old part of the house to try to capture evidence. I really don't know why I did this. Looking back, it was likely to get proof from my mom. She was a skeptic up until recently. My oldest cousin was using my old digital camera, and Caleb was recording audio. The room felt heavy. The air felt too thick to catch our breath. Suddenly, I felt something touch me, and I looked down to see my shirt being tugged at in different directions, like a bunch of hands were trying to climb their way up my torso. We fled the room in terror. All of us camped out in my brother's room that night. I slept with my grandma's charms for protection that night. Well, for a while, actually. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I never felt that coldness and darkness again, that I never heard that terrible voice. But it wasn't. For years, into my 20s, I had night terrors of the voice and the feeling that came with it. They felt different than any nightmare or night terror I had ever experienced. I believe part of it stayed with me the whole time. It's been about 10 years since I dealt with the voice. I'm glad it's gone. Whenever it spoke, I had no control. It did. I'm no longer afraid of it, but I do worry that other things may want to replace it. And me. If you made it through this email, if I worked up the nerve to send it, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing people's stories. You're doing incredible work for not only others, but yourself. I would love to share more of my experiences with you if you want to hear them. I'm starting to think it wasn't just the houses we lived in that were haunted. I think it could be us. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you again. Cheyenne. Thank you so much for sharing this, Cheyenne. And yes, I would absolutely love to hear your other stories, and I'm sure everyone else would too. So I've talked about Ouija boards a couple times on this show. It is really easy to downplay their power because Hasbro and other toy companies make them. But the actual physical tool that you use is not as important. People have told me of crazy paranormal experiences they've had with makeshift spirit boards, like a piece of paper and a CD. Anything physical can become a spiritual tool because ultimately it's not about the tool, it's about the mindset the tool puts you in. And since you already had a strong connection to the other side, you are already an open door for that entity to come into. And I'm so sorry that it affected you for that long. And for those of you who are thinking of having some Halloween fun with a Ouija board this holiday, don't be scared when you get what you came for. Chapter 2. What did you summon? With Aaron Sagers.
My name is Aaron Sagers. I live in New York City. I'm a journalist and researcher, and I began my career as a professional in mainstream newspapers and magazines talking about news and entertainment news. However, I made a mark in the paranormal community talking about the connection between popular culture and the unexplained and exploring how entertainment influences belief and how belief influences entertainment. Over time, I realized that in a way, I had always been connected to this topic. As a kid, I was super into comic books and science fiction and horror movies, but also paranormal and paranormal theories. And I do think that was born out of a sincere interest in the topic. However, it was also connected to my weird history and my weird background.
I met Aaron because we were both talking heads on Paranormal Caught on Camera. Just an FYI, this was recorded back in May of 2020.
Some of this has actually just come to light recently. Now, I'm right now, right before I went into isolation or lockdown due to the pandemic, right before then, days before that, I visited my family in Florida and over lunch kind of peeled off the Band-Aid about this time in my family's history. When I was very young, I'm the youngest of 5 kids, and I was raised Catholic. And when I was very young, there was some strange happenings in my home in Florida. It wasn't an old spooky house. It was a fairly, modern ranch home. However, my sister was reporting hearing scratching in the walls at night, and it wasn't rodents because, our house was treated for that. And she said that's not what it sounded like anyhow. And my second oldest brother was reporting seeing things. And my mother was terrified of being home alone. She was a stay-at-home mom. And me, being the youngest, reported seeing at one point this very tall, shadowy, almost like very lanky figure standing in the doorway of my bedroom. And I do recall, even though I was very young and, memory is somewhat unreliable, but the image I have in my mind is of this thing that almost had a monster face, almost like something that you would see from a rubber Halloween mask with this crazy hair and a sharp nose and sharp chin and really craggly, really wrinkly and deep set eyes. I remember that, even though it was shrouded in the darkness, I do kind of remember this face, and it terrified me. And what I came to find out even recently was that my oldest brother was very angry about things going on in his life, and he decided he wanted to exert some sort of control over those things, over his life. I think that's very relatable as a teenager. And he told the story very recently, right before we entered lockdown, or before I entered lockdown, about how he remembers being in his bedroom and he had toyed around with some chants and spells and whatnot, but recalls, like, in his words, summoning something that he wouldn't say the name, he wouldn't say what exactly he believed he was summoning, but it was some sort of dark energy, dark force, and he received some sort of visual confirmation. He said it looked almost as if it was like staticky and glowing, almost like an old, like what happens when you turn on an old CRT television set. And well, that appeared to kick off a lot of strange activity in my home where everybody was impacted in a different way. And my mom even recalls that there was this picture that my brother drew and that he hung in his room. It was like monstrous, but it wasn't like, a satanic image or anything. But for some reason, this sketch that he drew terrified her. One day while everyone was at school, she heard the garbage man coming down, the truck coming down the street, and viewed that as an opportunity. And she ran to the back of the house where the kids' bedrooms were, tore this off the wall, and ran it outside and threw it in the trash can just as the garbage man was coming, because she just needed to have it out of the house. So everyone was reporting various levels of trauma, and my brother, he says that he didn't realize that he was causing this much trouble, but what sort of resulted after all this is years of like odd circumstance and happenings. My mother became very ill and fell into a coma for several months and was on life support. There was some various tragedies. Even the house after we moved out, there was some tragedies, including a man dying in the room where my brother claimed to summon this thing. And it was a young man who died of a heart attack. And for me, what was interesting is over the years, periodically I would see this figure again. I didn't necessarily in the same details as it was when I was a child, but there were a couple times where this thing would sort of re-emerge. I mean, I remember when I was, I must have been 18 years old, and I was about to graduate high school. So it was spring of that year, not thinking about the paranormal at that point. At that point, it was very much college and hanging out with friends and pursuing girls, that kind of thing. I was not really caught up in the paranormal at that point. It was not part of my daily pursuit, but I distinctly recall like having this dream where I was at a party and I was with a bunch of friends, and it was a graduation party because that was what was going on in my life. And at one point, someone at the party who I didn't recognize said, "Hey, Aaron, come here, Aaron." And I started going down this hallway in my dream. And as I was walking down the hallway, things sort of shifted in the dream to not a friendly celebratory atmosphere, but instead kind of threatening almost. And I kept hearing this voice, "Hey, Aaron, come here, Aaron." I remember waking, and I was awake, and I was sleepwalking, and I was sleepwalking towards my closet. And I distinctly recall I was walking towards my closet and I heard a voice say, come here, Aaron." Whether it was real or not real, the result was being so terrified that I, did run back into bed and pull up the covers and hide away, afraid of this thing that, again, had that sort of weird familiarity to it. Like, just the voice felt familiar. Like, it does make me think there was some sort of connection, this thing that pops in every so often, to the weird stuff as a child. But I do recall this time when I was staying home alone, and it was not the first time I stayed home alone, probably early on in that time, but that was an exciting time as a kid to, like, now you can, like, have the house to yourself, and you're a big kid and watching TV, hanging out on the couch, just having a grand old time. And at one point, hearing our garage was connected to a door in the kitchen in the next room over, and hearing the distinct sound of that garage door opening, and then something moving about the kitchen, making not a lot of noise, not like crashing, but slight shuffling and whatnot. And I thought someone was breaking into the house while I was home alone, and frozen with fear, literally frozen, and not knowing what was going to happen. And it felt like this was kind of continuing for ages, and being in the right next room over, being consumed with fear of, like, okay, well, if something is in that kitchen, in the room, moving around, it could now walk through, and I'm exposed. I'm just like, I'm not a big kid at all. I'm just suddenly a little scared kid, and wanting parents to be home suddenly. So this thing was moving around for a bit, and then it did dissipate, I guess. I don't know exactly what happened, but it did dissipate, and I was still overcome with fear for what felt like hours until my family did return home, until my parents returned home, and saying, like, I think someone just broke into the house. And of course, there was no evidence of that. The door was locked. There wasn't anything askew or missing. And they probably just thought, he's not ready to stay home alone. Things got to the point that a priest did come to the house and bless it. And there is some question about whether or not it was an exorcism rite. My mother says it was. And apparently that did not stop the activity. So then another priest came through and had to do it again. And that still didn't necessarily remove the activity. And, of course, I find out later through my work with the paranormal that it's not like a one and done kind of thing when you have certain rituals like that. I do look back on my life and that time in the house, and it does strike me as creepy, and it does strike me as like something occurred there. But my brother never really sent this thing away. Is the other scary part, is he doesn't claim that he necessarily regrets what he did. So my brother he must have been around 16 or 17 years old, and I was quite young. And as far as where he discovered this incantation or whatever, I don't know precisely. It was during the 80s, during a time of the satanic panic, and certainly my parents were very sensitive and aware of that. Heavy metal, Dungeons and Dragons, everything was considered like potentially evil in nature, like certain elements of pop culture. And I don't ascribe to that. I don't think that at all. But my brother was interested in those things, but I think that he must have pursued something else. I don't know where it comes from. This is sort of the thing that I love my brother, but it does drive me insane, because he gets quite dodgy about it. It did make him feel empowered. It did make him feel empowered, and it did kind of give him what he was seeking on some level. And while he regrets the fact that family members suffered potentially as a result of what happened, he doesn't necessarily regret that sense of empowerment that he received. So, but when I was down there, right at the end of February, I had this sort of paranormal intervention, if you will, where I was just like, what the hell is the deal with that house? What the hell is the deal with the house on George Street? Weird stuff was happening there. And it seemed like now, years later, when you look at my family, it kind of impacted everybody in a different way, each of the 5 kids. And my mom says now that she believes that there was something evil in that house and believes that it didn't go away. Working as a journalist and then traveling around the world, I have had the fortune to be in a lot of different supposedly haunted locations. And, one of my favorite is probably the one that launched me into the professional realm within the paranormal. I was on essentially a ride along with a TV show, a paranormal reality TV show. I was working as a journalist, and this was a mainstream newspaper. This wasn't like a paranormal periodical or anything. And I was at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, and I was walking along, and I had an interest in the paranormal, but I didn't necessarily believe it or not believe it at this phase in my life. And I popped my head into one of these cells, or something caught my eye in these long, dark cell blocks of Eastern State Penitentiary. And I look into one of these cells, and it appeared that there was some sort of figure, shadow figure is the term we use, pacing back and forth. I don't think I knew the term shadow figure at the time, but pacing back and forth against the far side of this cell block. And there was a barrier, so you couldn't fully enter this cell block. So I poked my head in, thinking that I was about to talk to myself. And I was like, okay, if there's something really back there, come closer. And the pacing of this thing suddenly stopped and then rushed me. And my whole field of vision went black. It was just filled with blackness. And I recall jumping back and letting out a slew of profanities, expletives. And like once I kind of regained my senses, I looked back and there was this thing pacing back and forth. And I didn't say anything to anyone at the time. Again, operating as a journalist and trying to maintain this objective approach. Well, later on that evening, some of the people from this show, the team, was walking by this same cell block. They did not know the experience I had had. And one of them pokes their head in there and they're like, oh, wow, it actually looks like there's some sort of figure pacing back and forth. And it was an interesting validation. I still think about that experience and I think, what did I not account for? Did I account for the lighting? Did I account for what were all the environmental elements that I thought of and I have thought of many, many times? Did I account for all of that? I believe I did. I believe that I can safely say that it was an unexplained experience. This was at actually Ohio State Reformatory, and which is another prison. I swear I go to places that are not prisons. And this was during a paranormal event. I was there as a speaker. I recall I was speaking to a group of people during an investigation portion of the evening. I was with Chris Fleming, who is a psychic and medium and a buddy of mine. He was using a spirit box at one point, which I get quite skeptical of. At one point, however, it said like my first, middle, and last name, clear as day, to the point where people around could hear my middle name and nobody would know that because I don't use my middle name. And then shortly thereafter, I think the group had moved on to the next location, but Fleming and I were looking against this wall, and this is a far end of this long hallway, and it appeared that there was a series of almost like of a couple things that looked like just shadow torso type things crawling up a wall and then across the top of the ceiling and then like just sort of moving along. And that was a freaky AF, I would say. We seek to make sense of the things that we encounter, right? We look for patterns as humans. So based on my visual reference, it looked like there was a top part of a body and something that appeared to be a head and arms, that looked like they were creepy crawly going up the wall. And I'm not sitting here saying it was most certainly a ghost or an entity or whatever. I don't know. That thing did not stick around for me to have an interview with it and get a quote as to its origin. But it was something that I could not explain in the moment. So, this is also why I don't present myself as an investigator, is that like, I'm sure some of my colleagues out there probably would have thought about things in a different way, but I think about it from sort of a journalistic and research perspective. I really would like to have an interview with whatever that thing was. So the thing that was in my house, it did feel bad, did feel malicious. And I will say that there's been some encounters throughout the years where I felt that weird familiarity that felt malevolent. I don't want to say inhuman, I don't know. However, I've traveled to so many different locations seeking these things out. So yeah, I've had encounters that seem fairly mundane comparatively. I was not too long ago, I was on the Queen Mary in Long Beach, and I was doing an event there, and I had meant to get in early that day, flying from New York, so I could have the entire day in Long Beach, maybe hit a tiki bar. And instead, I got in quite late due to delays and whatnot. I was so tired. It was, by the time I got to my room, it was 2 a.m. West Coast time, and that means 5 a.m. East Coast for me. And I just got into bed. I just wanted to pass out. I was so tired. And I slip into bed, and a moment later, I feel the cover next to me sort of lift. And then essentially I felt like this weight slide in next to me. And I was just like, no, not now. Like, I don't want to deal with this right now. Like, I'm here all weekend talking about ghosts, and like, let's do this later. And sort of a beat passes, and then that sense of weight dissipates, and then the sheet kind of settled back down. I find that when you pursue these things and you're traveling a lot to do it, you kind of are just a little bit more tuned into it just because the circumstance invites it. I do think that it is interesting, and it is something that I'm actually still kind of wrapping my head around, since some of these revelations are fairly recent. I believe I was talking to my sister about the Netflix show, The Haunting of Hill House. And I was always a big fan of that Shirley Jackson story. But when I was watching the adaptation on Netflix, I was thinking, crap, that there's elements of this that kind of remind me of my own family. And when I was talking to my sister about it, she pretty much said the same thing before I could even get the words out of my mouth. Whatever it is, I do think that there's something that has stuck around or impacted my family in various ways. This is now like turned into a therapy session, Sapphire. It's weird for me because I look at footage, I talk to people about ghosts, I do presentations about fact-based things and folklore and things that connect to the paranormal. And I could talk about that all day. I love it. And I love talking to people. But maybe when it comes to me and me talking about this thing, that's where I hit this wall and face this reluctance to fully open up to it, or there's something about it that holds me back a little bit. And I am
Hmm.
certainly reluctant to call it paranormal, but I have been reluctant to talk about it. So before this interview, I've maybe talked about it just throughout the years informally with a couple trusted people. It's one thing to talk about a potential ghost story of an old manor or a prison or a hospital, or to talk to people about their stories and empathize with them. But when you start kind of going down your own history, things can suddenly become a little bit more unwieldy. And as
Hmm.
a journalist, my approach is to interview and get the story from someone else. And that's kind of my go-to. It's to speak to other people about what happened to them. It's, talking about myself that I sometimes find a little bit more challenging.
The stories continue after the break. And now, the stories continue. Chapter 3: My Brother's Demon, submitted by KS. About a year and a half ago, I had one of the most intense paranormal encounters that I've ever experienced. To preface, I have always been very spiritual. I'm very empathetic and I'm pretty in tune with my clairs. I'm not sure if I'm what you would call a medium, but I often perform small readings on friends and family. I describe it like I am a radio receiver and my antenna picks up the vibrations of spirits, people, and entities around me, with or without my consent sometimes. And especially since this event, I've kind of backed off from feeding into my spiritual gifts. I feel like the more I use it, the more entities are attracted to me. And I honestly don't feel like playing telephone anymore. My brother and I are Native American, and he's also a very spiritual person. We were living together at the time, and we were walking home from the gym when something happened. We were just walking and chit-chatting when I became aware that we weren't alone. I saw in my mind's eye on the other side of my brother that there was someone walking who wasn't there, and I began to see a clear picture of long black feathers. I asked my brother if he felt weird, and he said that there was some off energy. We kept walking, and I decided to feed into it. I just kept getting more and more of this off energy, and I could start to pick out some more physical features. To me, he looked like a very, very pale man, almost emaciated from how skinny he was, with sunken in dark eyes, and he had a long, disgusting, protruding nose. He was wearing a long sort of cloak made out of black feathers. It was a really intense energy that I have yet to ever come in contact with this clearly. It felt like a low, buzzing vibration, like an enveloping, static energy that made my skin tingle and my ears ring. I could tell that it was there for my brother, and it was attached to him. It just felt like such a big presence, and I was an easy channel to get to him. We got back to my brother's car, and I began to feel eyes on me, and I knew we were still being watched by it. My brother asked it to speak to him. I could see in my head this image of the thing opening its mouth really wide and making these noises that I could only describe as foul. It sounded like gravel in a rock tumbler over rusty nails on a chalkboard. But my brother wasn't scared. In fact, he said he felt safe. I was trying really hard to keep my energy stable and keep my mental shields up, but it was really, really difficult. It felt like the electricity was running through my body. I couldn't move, and all I could hear and see was this thing opening its mouth, and all this terrible noise would spill out. The shockwaves of the energy washing over me was the most terrifying thing I have ever felt. This spirit was demanding. It had a purpose, and it wouldn't leave until its purpose was fulfilled. It wanted my brother. But I was such an easy conduit that it was using a lot of my energy to manifest itself. It sapped me pretty quick, but it came to do what it wanted. I went home, cried, and went to sleep. Months later, I found out that my brother really wasn't a good person. To make a long story short, he broke our lease and left me in the dust. While talking to one of his ex-girlfriends, who is a generational bruja, she told me that at the end of their relationship, she could feel a gross presence attached to him. She said it looked like a spirit guide to my brother, but was a trickster of sorts, and was actually a demon. She said it had a gross long nose and the face of a rat. My jaw dropped. I finally told her about the time I saw that entity, and when I described it to her, she confirmed that that was what she was picturing in her mind. Sapphire, I've been following you and your content for 5 or 6 years now. I respect your opinion and would like to know what you think of this encounter, and if you agree with us. My hypothesis is that my brother is exactly the type of person who might attract something negative like this, because of the type of negativity that they tend to spread, and it wanted a piece of that delicious pie. Thank you for your email. That sounds very disturbing, and I do agree with your hypothesis. So, if you're in the darkness long enough, your eyes eventually adjust. And because your brother was operating in this lower vibrational state, he saw this entity as his friend. It's the same with anyone in a toxic relationship. When you're in it, it's harder to see the bigger picture, whereas it might seem so obvious to people on the outside. And that's what these entities are banking on. It wants to find people who haven't learned how to discern a friend or a foe. And the way that you learn how to do so is through experience. And I have felt what it feels like when something is of a higher vibration. It makes me feel like I'm about to float off into space if I don't hold on to something. And something on the other end of the spectrum makes me feel very heavy and slow and scared. But this might be different for other people. Thank you again for your email, and I hope that everything with your brother is okay. Chapter 4, Scratched, with Pythian Priestess.
Hello, my name is Pythian Priestess. I'm from Los Angeles, California, and I am an initiated Hermetic priestess.
Pythian Priestess works at a magical supply shop I frequent, the Crooked Path.
I lived in a very Catholic family, so my interactions with the spirit world were very private, although people in my family would admit once in a while they did see ghosts or angels. When I was 4 years old, my great aunt, who was a Benedictine nun, said, "Would you like to be a nun?" And I thought about it, and I was like, "No, I would rather be a priest." And she said, "You can't do that. You're a woman." And I was like, "Well, I don't care about this anymore." So my search began at a very early age. I had known that I had gifts, and I studied it in the limited capacity that I could, until I met a boyfriend who was studying Santeria and Hoodoo. And he taught me some things, and so did his family. But it wasn't until I moved to Los Angeles where I was really able to express my genuine interest in all things occult and paranormal, where I did become initiated as a priestess in 2020, right before the pandemic. When I was in college, I was a professional ghost tour guide, and I did some paranormal hunts there as well. So I went to college in St. Augustine, Florida, at Flagler College. Shout out, undergrad. And I had to get a job. And I was like, being a ghost tour guide sounds like a lot of fun. It's a lot of acting, and that was something I was exploring at the time. I also wanted to seek out the paranormal experiences because I finally had that opportunity where they didn't just happen to me randomly. So I worked there for like 2 years, maybe a little bit less. And it got so bad, the experiences that I had, that I not only quit, but they still use me in their script today as like some of the craziest experiences. So one of the places, we go to two places on this tour. One is to Anastasia Island at the lighthouse, and then the old jail. And the old jail, the last hanging they had was like in 1959. So like pretty recently. Not great. Not great track record there. It was also a segregated jail where white men were on the top, people of color were on the bottom, and then there was solitary confinement. So that meant that the feces and urine would drip down, and the jail would smell really bad. And sometimes you could go there, like in there, and you could kind of like smell it. It was like so gross. But that's not why I quit. One time I was in solitary confinement. Like you had to go through and you like lock the people in the solitary confinement area for like 20 seconds. It's not a big deal. But that meant that I only had to go into the jail for less than 2 minutes. I brought them in and then I'd go, oh no, the lights went off, because they did. Let me go check the circuit breaker. And then like I'd scream and run away. Well, one time I came out of like locking up the door. The second tour guide would come and get them. And I was like, wow, my thighs itch. My butt itches. What is going on? Did I get mosquito bites? This is Florida. Maybe they like got trapped under my skirt. Let me go check it out. And I had scratches, like tons, like someone was grabbing my thighs and my bottom of my butt. And it was like, when you have, for anyone who's ever been hurt or harmed by an entity, this is like an infernal burning. It burns from the inside of your skin. Nothing will remedy, not aloe, not lotion, not water, this pain that you're experiencing. So I went and I showed one of my coworkers. And she's like, that is very serious. So I did some witchy things. Like, honestly, now looking back, I was like, oh, you dumb child. You were not protected. I like carried pennies in my pocket. I carried mint and peppermint and thyme. Very cute. Did not help me. So a couple of months later, I had that feeling again. I went in, I left my crew, I screamed, lights went out. And I come out, I was like, oh, my chest really hurts. So I go and I check, and on the side of my breast, there were 3 scratch marks. And I was like, oh, this is for serious. Because it hadn't happened in like 3 or 4 months. I was like, maybe it's done. Maybe it's over with. And that's when, I sent it to the guy that I was dating at the time. And he's like, you need to get out of there, because that you're bordering on no longer just like a negative energy. With a 3 like that, you're looking at infernal, or what some people would call demonic energies. And I was like, so I have to quit my job? Okay. So I did quit. And you know what was terrible? Was they put me through a psych eval to make sure that I wasn't like psychotic or like crazy. And then they told me that it was too bad that I was quitting because I was really good at my job. And I was like, you're right. But if you genuinely believe the stories that we tell here and the people who were at this jail who committed the most heinous crimes, from murder to molestation, you would understand what energies that I'm putting myself in every single night. And the guy did not get it. I was like, okay, bye. I have many ideas of what that could have been. So the first thing to understand is that when something negative happens in a place like that, so not only is it just a place where people's lives were taken through hangings, also there were guillotines there up until the early 1900s. So a lot of bloodshed on the ground. We also have to understand that it was land that was taken very recently at that time from the First Nations peoples, which also required a lot of bloodshed. So the area already is very old and has a lot of war energy. Then we have to take into account all the people that were placed here and all the horrible things that they had done and the energy they were radiating. When this happens, there's so much negative energy or heavy energy, it creates what we call a pole. We have magnetic poles on the earth. We also get vortexes. This is a negative pole or a negative vortex. Things that may be heavy energies, such as we would call demonic energies or infernal energies, it's easier for that veil to be walked through. So I guess if we're going to put it in Hollywood terms, it's a portal to hell. So I think the thing that was hurting me was probably a low-ranking demonic energy. It could have been, so there are these things on Earth. They're not demons or like infernal. They're not below us. They're at our level. They're called elementals. Sometimes those little energies like to pick up astral shells, which are like when we die, we leave our physical body behind, also part of our astral body. And they can pick them up and put them on as masks and masquerade. And when something picks up that mask, it becomes that energy. So there were rapists and there were bad men who were in this place who would have done those things to me. I'm sure I was 19, blonde, and innocent in a lot of ways. So I think that those are the most two likely options. I don't think it was like some crazy high-ranking energy that was after me. I think it was low level demonic infernal energy, or it was an elemental masquerading as a ghost or human shell.
Anything similar ever happened since?
Oh, I didn't let it happen. Absolutely. That was probably the most traumatic supernatural experience. Like I would say, trigger warning to everyone listening, that is akin to spiritual sexual assault.
I feel like the scratching and the touching is like always the stuff that like we see in those shows, but it's almost seen as not a big deal, but almost like super common. And like people go to these places to experience that. So I've never really heard it called out for what it is. It is assault. Like if it was a human touching you in places they shouldn't be touching.
I'd like to say this. There's a difference between a magician or a witch or a priestess to a paranormal investigator. We control the energies in that space. Those energies do not control us, and we do not fear them. I'm going to be a dork for a second. So if you've ever played Pokemon, every Pokemon has certain stats. They have an attack, a defense, and an HP. Humans are very similar when it comes to their stats for psychic awareness. Some people have really low psychic awareness. They got like very little on the radar, and they may not be able to pick up on the subtle energies that are happening. As someone who is full of psychic awareness, their bar is totally full. So that's part of the reason. The second reason is that paranormal phenomenon happens at a vibrational and conscious level, meaning that my consciousness, yes, I'm still experiencing the world, but it is through this lens that I'm wearing, whereas you are wearing a different lens. So the heavier the energy, such as the swing moving, we can all see that. But if someone is going to maybe hear voices or be able to see vibrational beings, that is a different kind of, again, where are you on the stats? And those hearing and seeing things are more subtle. They're lighter. So if you are having trouble perceiving the heightened consciousness, it's because your mind is not heightened consciousness. People who are psychic are open to things, right? Open means your crown chakra is open. If your crown chakra is not open, you're not going to perceive it. I'll tell you about the time that a spell went bad. That was a really bad experience. So it was the full moon in Pisces in 2020. And that was a bad time. So I had taken on a client spell where she had some really negative energy being directed towards her. Someone was doing work against her. And she asked me if I could block it for her. I was like, yeah, no problem. I'll block it for you. What I didn't do was give it a place to go. So it came to me. And I started having relationship problems, even though the person I was like seeing at the time was not very mature. It just got worse and worse. And then I was on the phone with a girlfriend and I heard this crack. And I was like, uh-oh. Well, something just broke on my altar. Let me go check it out. So I go over and the altar, the candle had broken. The glass had shattered everywhere. So in those candles, it kind of looks like this one. I'll give you an example. So it was cut about here and the whole thing was on fire. And that was really bad. And I was like, okay, let me snuff it out. So I take my little snuffer, I'm like snuffing out, it won't go out. And I was like, oh, this is a spiritual thing. So I take the patent of salt that I had, I poured it over the fire, I got it out, but I didn't have time to clear out the energy fast enough before it actually attacked me, because that was my mistake. I put out the candle before I prepared to remove the energy. And the best way I could describe it is 1,000 little ants crawling all over me. And it was the worst feeling in the world. I felt like I was kind of like, I was crying. I was already in a bad place. And I had to call someone and I was like, I really need your help spiritually right now. Like, I need you to like astrally like remove this from me. And so they did. And that's not possession by any means. That is just an energy taking over your energy field, but it was incredibly unpleasant. Psychically protect yourself and make sure if you're protecting others to still protect yourself. I'm going to preface this with this may be a hot take or whatever the kids call it these days, and a controversial opinion. When you are trying to contact energies, paranormal investigators, please learn how to protect yourselves. Getting scratches, that's not cool. That's bad. That means that something penetrated your energy field and hurt you. I get it. It's been 10 years, 13, 15 years that this stuff has been on the air. It's not scary anymore, but it is still. It holds a lot of ramifications and can cause a lot of pain to you internally and externally. You can still go hunting and you can still find those experiences, but I recommend learning how to open a sacred space and calling forth energies that are for your highest good, energies that are benevolent. Because when you seek out that negative stuff, yes, you can build a rapport with it. There are witches who work with demons or infernal spirits, as we prefer to call them. Those spirits don't respect you. You are an investigator. You are not a witch. You are not a magician. You are not a priestess. So you are an ant to them. Be careful and be smart. If you're interested in magic and you want to discover more about your path into the paranormal, you can listen to the Occult Unveiled podcast. I host it. I have guests from both the paranormal world, the occult world, even the book world. You can also check me out on all social media platforms as Pythian Priestess.
Thanks for joining me today. Have you ever encountered a demon? Send me an email at story@storieswithsapphire.com. Your response can make it on a future episode. Salamat and happy Halloween. Stories with Sapphire is created and produced by me, Sapphire Sandalo, and is part of the Spectre Vision Radio Podcast Network. Theme song by Sapphire Sandalo. Special thanks to Cheyenne, Aaron Sagers, KS, and Pythian Priestess. For more information on the show, visit storieswithsapphire.com.